You know, you think something's going to go away just because, well, of generations, of time, everything. Well, the shootout in Medina, that hasn't gone away. My daughters are in their 30s, and they still know everything about the shootout. And in fact, Ashley studied it at law school in Marquette, and it's, you know, I was just visiting with Jack Zaleski, and his daughter studied it as well. It is part of who we are as a state, as a region, as part of the country in many cases. Gordon Call and what happened 40 years ago today. I suppose I'm supposed to say 40 years ago tonight, but it is that anniversary of the Medina Shootout, and it's something that we got to talk about, and we're going to today. Paul Jurgens, head of the news team here, news director on the Mighty 790 for years. Paul, good to have you on.
My pleasure, yes.
That way I know your mic's working. Jack Zaleski, longtime editor with the Fargo Forum. Jack, thanks for coming in today.
Nice to be here, Joel, as always.
Jim Shaw, journalist in many capacities. Then you were with WDAY TV.
Correct.
Yep, he's in. And Darrell Dorgan, somebody that you saw in many roles, news director in radio, obviously the lead person for years with PBS. Darrell, good to have you with us as well.
It's great to be here and find out that people like Jack Zaleski are still being able to get around.
And the first shot is taken. The first,
You're on dangerous ground, my friend. Be careful.
So Paul, I know that you had a lot of old sound when it comes to this. Before we use some of that, let's just go around the table and do this. Where were you when this happened? And I'm going to start with you, Darrell. Where were you when this all took place in Medina?
I was home in Bismarck, and my wife and I were getting ready to go out and have dinner with the AP bureau chief and his wife. He called us about 5:30 in the afternoon and kind of hinted around, you know, we've got a problem. We've got a couple people killed, U.S. Marshals. And, you know, neither of us wanted to say, hey, we don't want to have dinner. We're both going to our offices. But eventually we did. And so that's what happened. And it became a 1 or 2 year obsession, really. We followed it very closely. The problem was very simple. The reason it happened is the U.S. Marshals were simply outgunned, outmanned.
Jack, where were you when all this took place?
At that time, I was editor at the Devils Lake Daily Journal, you know, north of where it happened, somewhat north of where it happened, following it like everyone else does, usually mostly from the Associated Press dispatches, and decided to join and went down. And I don't know if you all remember, those who were covering it, the area had been socked in with a pretty heavy fog, and it lasted for a couple of days. I think that fog hung in there, and I remember crawling around and following these caravans of federal vehicles, and then getting, and we'll probably talk about those two news conferences that one of the principal federal people had that went after the media, and then he later apologized. But it was kind of a. It certainly wasn't organized. I mean, there was a media center set up in the Jamestown Sun. Jim Smarata, I don't know if some of you will remember that name, was the editor then, and they set up a media center there. And so we were working out of the Jamestown Sun, and all of us were sending dispatches back to our various newsrooms and like that. So we were down there for a couple of days, and then went back to Devil's Lake.
Jim,
I was at home, and I was called, and I was told, "Get ready, because tomorrow, you are heading out looking for Gordon Call." And I had no idea who Gordon Call was. And so from that point forward, that was my story. On Monday, we were up in the Heaton area where it looked like half the U.S. Army was out there firing into Gordon Call's house. I went into the house after the shooting was over, after the Army had fired all their tear gas in there, with Gordon Call's daughter, not knowing anything about tear gas, and I was overcome by the tear gas. I started burning up. And so we then went over to get some help, just get some wet cloths. Janice Call, YORRIE Call's wife. YORRIE Call at that point is in the hospital fighting for his life. He'd been shot, and she doesn't know me from a hole in the wall, and she's helping, keeping me breathing okay. But I just remember that house was so shot up. It was just ruined with stains and broken windows everywhere and the smell, but they couldn't find Gordon. And then from that point forward, I think the next day we went to Ashley, North Dakota, where they looked there, and then we were in Jamestown. So I think I was gone from Fargo for the next week and a half. Every day I was out with law enforcement searching for Gordon Call and not finding him.
Paul?
I was a young reporter, didn't work here at the time. I worked at KVOX in South Moorhead, and so we didn't have the resources that KFGO did in those days to cover a story like this. We could. Much of it was done remotely and with help of other radio stations up and down the region, Carrington, Bismarck. So that's what I recall initially. Shortly after the shooting, I was hired here, and they said, oh, by the way, your first major assignment will be the call trial. And I don't know if I'd ever been into a courthouse other than to maybe get a marriage license. And so that was coming up in, May?
May.
What was so amazing is a case like this today, it would take 2-3 years before this case would have gone to trial, but it went to
Not
trial
only
very
would it
quickly.
take 2 to 3 years, it would never have been held in Fargo.
No.
It would never have been held by Judge Paul Benson, who knew the guys who were killed and
Kenneth
shot.
Nero very well.
And Lynn Crooks would never have been allowed to be the prosecutor. There were just so many
There were conflicts.
ethical issues that were not brought up then that you could not get away with today.
Well, I want to do this, Paul. I want to make sure people understand the sounds of what happened that night, and I know you've prepared some of that. What do you want to run with first?
Well, our initial reporting at the time was that night. The shooting was 5:30, 6 o'clock. Weather was much like it was today. Recently,
It was a beautiful day.
For February,
it was
yes.
like in the 40s and 50s. Unheard of in the middle of February around here.
I was fortunate enough, and I mentioned this on the air the other day. We were talking about it just briefly. I had a lot of archive tape from KFGO's coverage, and again, I had just started here shortly after the shooting. But I was lucky enough to find some of this, and it's on cassette tapes. If anybody, younger audience, is cassette, okay? And it's really amazing that these cassettes, 40 years later, are still viable. The tape hasn't. I was worried going through this that I'm going to snap a tape, and fortunately, I did not. So I went through hours of tape here, literally. Some of these are the law enforcement transmissions that we'll hear, and if we're ready, I think we can start with some of the initial reporting from KFGO news reporter Paul Newberg the night of the shooting.
North Dakota is one of the most agricultural states in the nation. There's little crime, maybe a murder a year, and an occasional bank robbery, but that's about it. Before February 13th, 1983, no one in the state would ever have dreamed there could be a gun battle on the prairie. Killing, wounding, and over taxes, no less. Then came that Sunday evening in question. It was relatively mild for North Dakota, about 20 above, as I recall. It was a sleepy day. Nothing generally happens here, much less on a Sunday, but about 6 p.m., automatic weapons fire could be heard near Medina. People died, and 20 minutes later, the police scanner in our studios blurted out the initial sketchy information. KFGO went on the air minutes later with the bare facts. But as the evening went on, it became evident this was no ordinary case. We interrupted programming on a regular basis for about 6 hours. Around midnight, the basic pieces to the puzzle began to fall into place. By 1 o'clock, I was able to roll the following story off the typewriter, putting together much of what had been gleaned from the previous hours. 2 U.S. Marshals are dead, 2 suspects are in custody, and 2 more suspects are at large following a gun battle near Medina, North Dakota last night. Medina is a small community about 30 miles west of Jamestown. One of the slain marshals is identified as 53-year-old Ken Muir of Fargo, while the name of the other slain deputy marshal is being withheld until relatives are notified. Another deputy marshal, 58-year-old James Hobson of Bismarck, is listed in critical condition, while a Stutzman County Sheriff's deputy and a Medina police officer were wounded, though less seriously.
Paul Newberg of our news staff in 1983.
Radio at its best, by the way.
Yes, yeah. Was here all night, of course, working on that story, and so that was kind of the initial word on KFGO and what had taken place early on.
Well, I know we've got one more piece of sound we're going to play before we go to Darrell Dorgan and talk to him here a second.
Yes, prior to the shooting, Medina Police Chief Darrell Graff asked the marshals to set up their roadblock outside the city. This is Graff's exchange with Deputy Marshal Carl Wigglesworth.
A half a mile up north on that hill or something?
5205, there's a couple avenues of escapes up that way. We just thought cutting them off here at the railroad tracks is going to be cut off their avenues of escape.
No, there ain't no avenues of escape. If they go north, if you go north about 1 mile on top of that hill, there's a vacant farm. There's no roads. They can go either direction. There's lakes on both sides of the road. You'll get them up there, and there won't be nobody in town injured.
Okay, that's 10-4. We'll go.
So he talked him into going north.
Yes, he did.
I'm going to go to Darrell Dorgan. Darrell, that sound has to bring back a lot of memories for you.
It does, and but what also brings it spurs a lot of memories because state officials really didn't know what the cause of this thing was, and there was a lot of speculation. The governor and another state law enforcement official held a press conference. I think it was about 8:30 at night. And really didn't have any information. They were just kind of answering some questions or trying to calm nerves, I guess. The state official involved in law enforcement called me, said, "What do you know about this?" And I said, "It's a tax problem." Because we had contact at KBMR radio with these people prior to that. And so then about a half hour later, the governor and the other law enforcement official were on the radio saying, well, we think it's a tax problem and a question over taxes and a protest over taxes. And that's when it really got going. But we had contact with some of these people beforehand, and I had been to one of their meetings.
Well, Jack,
there was a cast of characters here that was amazing.
Okay. Jack Zaleski, I know that a lot of questions have been raised about why there. Paul just brought up why there, why then. I know in Bitter Harvest, and you just refreshed yourself with that, there's some speaking to that.
Well, there were questions at the time. There are still questions. People who, routinely like to question what law enforcement does, I guess. But the Forum had written an editorial dancing around that issue of why it was done the way it was done. And they said the answer to the questions, therefore, as to why they decided to interrupt that beautiful Sunday afternoon by attempting to arrest Call must forever remain in speculation. Well, Lynn Crooks, who was the lead prosecutor, Jim has recently interviewed Lynn Crooks, wrote in a response to that editorial that appeared in the Forum, and he said this, and this is in Jim Corcoran's definitive book about the incident called Bitter Harvest. Corcoran was a Forum reporter. It can only Crooks wrote this: "It can only be assumed that they went there because it was their duty. That was the kind of men they were. The question as to why they attempted the arrest on an open road can best be answered with a series of rhetorical questions. What would have been a better location? At the clinic? At a supermarket? At a neighbor's home? Where did Call go that he did not take weapons with him? His wife said he even took them to church. Where could the arrest have been attempted where the potential did not exist for innocent bystanders being injured if Call resisted arrest?" Crooks continued. "The Reardon driveway was chosen as a scene of confrontation by Call, not by the marshals," said Lynn Crooks.
And I know you spoke to Lynn recently.
Well, I did speak to Lynn, and we talked about some of that. I didn't realize, he gave me one of the great quotes, how personal this case was to him, because these guys were his friends, and he felt he was doing it for them. As far as that day, well, really what triggered it was Deputy Brad Kapp, worked for Stutzman County. He saw Gordon Call's car at the Medina Clinic, and he knew there was a warrant out, and then he reported it to the marshals, who decided, okay, this is as good as any. But realistically, they knew this could be trouble, but not this kind of trouble. And also, just to clarify, because like Paul and Jack and Darrell, at the beginning, we really didn't know, like, who are these people and what's going on? And then we found out the background, that they're protesting against taxes and whatnot. Gordon Call had been in prison for not filing his taxes. He was then released on probation, went out on probation, still didn't pay his taxes. But the big thing was, when you're out on probation, you have to report to a probation officer and you have to report to the courts, and he didn't do it. So the reason they were out to arrest him is because he violated the terms of his probation.
When we come back, we're going to, here's the thing. We're just going to keep going around the table because all of these four have so much information when it comes to this 40 years ago. And I have to tell you, driving by Medina, as much as what I do, every time I drive by Medina, I think of it. I do. And maybe that next generation, maybe that generation after me, or maybe two generations after me, maybe it'll take my grandkids not to think of it. But I know my daughters do as well. You drive by Medina and you think of that night.
Yeah, by this time in the standoff and shooting, Deputy Marshal Bob Cheshire, who died, he was shot initially and then was later shot in the head. He yells for help here. Carl Wigglesworth, the deputy marshal, is updating state radio communications in Bismarck, and this is where all the communications go through for state agencies. And a state trooper heads up to that scene, knowing that he's needed there, and then Wigglesworth confirms his earlier message to state radio.
Let's get hit off the head. Let's go, guys, on hit, bad. 5205, Cleveland. 5202 in Fargo. 5200 is DOA. 5207 is injured. American Court 5, dude. The copy has got injured and dead up there. Oh, I'm about 10 north of Edge. I'll be 1076. If you need any assistance up there, I'm sure. I'll be going up across 46 and Gackle that way. 5205, 41. 5205, go ahead. 52 6 is DOA. 5200 DOA. 5207 badly injured. 10-4, I copied. 5200 DOA, 5206 and 5207 is injured. 5206 is DOA. 5207 is injured.
Paul, for those people who might have struggled listening to that or not understanding what just happened.
Well, 5205 is Deputy Marshal Carl Wigglesworth, who I became friends with later in life. Knew Carl quite well. Died in 2005. But essentially, the shooting had taken place. They were asking for assistance from other surrounding law enforcement agencies. Prior to that, and this is my mistake here, I should have jumped to this cut before the previous sound. This is as the scene intensified as Cheshire, Deputy Marshal Cheshire, asked Marshal Muir for backup while James Hobson screamed for the others to move in. So let's go to that one.
Where are they, north of the vehicle, east of the vehicle?
We're set up right at the top of that hill there.
Carl, we're going to have the SO unit with us. The PD unit should be with you, and then we're going to check it out.
Stand around outside. You're going to have to stop both these vehicles. We're bringing up the rear. You got two station wagons coming at you. He was wearing blue and blue, blue jacket, blue pants. We're behind the second station wagon. We're just crossing the tracks. 10-4.
Coming in, they got 3 carbines. 10, let's call in units.
Where?
Is that 10-4, Ken?
Tell them to drop.
We're doing that. They're not doing it. Let's call in some more units. 10-4?
10-4, we got them coming.
Permission to call in more units, Ken? Ken, can I call in more units? Come on, we need them closer. Pull them in closer. Pull them in closer. We're looking right in the face of these guys. Let's go. You guys reading us? We got one behind a telephone pole. We got one in the station wagon, one in the Hornet. Copy? Ken, can we call some more units in? Ken, you there? Call. You want to give me Ken, please? Ken? Hey, you guys. Bring yourselves up here. We're standing looking these guns right in the face. Come up behind them. You've only got 1 point in your direction. We got 2 point in our direction. Get in the damn car and move this way.
So there, that was James Hobson, I believe, at the end there, telling the other units to move in. Ken Muir in that exchange with Bob Cheshire before the shots rang out there.
I was going to say, Jurgie, I remember they played all these tapes during the trial,
yes,
and especially the part where Cheshire says, "Officer hit,
yes,
officer hit, let's go, guys, I'm hit bad."
Right.
And then Carl Wigglesworth calls in to see that he's got 2 dead fellow officers and 1 very severely injured. I remember the courtroom was completely silent, and there were a lot of tears. It was maybe the most chilling thing I've ever heard in a courthouse, and maybe the most emotional reaction I've ever seen in a courtroom.
Well, they had a number of exhibits during the trial, too, and one of the vehicles at the Marshals, I believe Muir was driving a nondescript Dodge Diplomat, if I recall, but the Marshals out of Bismarck, Hobson, and Cheshire were driving this Ram Charger, and it's an SUV, a Dodge Ram Charger in the day, and the door of that Ram Charger, which was full of bullet holes, I believe was in the courtroom most of the trial, or at least a good part of it, and the jury, of course, would see that bullet hole-filled door of that Ram Charger every day.
Darrell, when you hear that sound, I mean, how much memory comes? How many memories come back to you?
A lot of it. First of all, there's a couple of things that need to be said. Cheshire was executed. He was shot in the head, in upper neck 3 times, and he was simply executed at very close range by Gordon Call. Keep that in mind. YORRIE Call may well have fired the first shot. He was behind a telephone pole. However, the first shot may also have been fired by one of the U.S. Marshals, which he could have done because they were being surrounded. It brings back just a lot of memories, and there are a lot of things that I have a connection with YORRIE Call. I write to him, he writes back, he answers some questions. He, to this day now, is filing another appeal. He lost one recently, so did Mr. Fall, and he claims the car was not registered to his dad. It was registered to his mother, the car that they thought. He also thinks that there was a spy the room. The thing was a setup. There's a lot of things here that aren't being dealt with reality even 40 years later. But keep in mind that there was a very close-up execution using an M14 rifle. That is not the kind of thing that you do. It was a psychotic break with reality by Gordon Call. And don't forget it. That's how it started.
Darrell, is there any admission at all from YORRIE Call that the role that he played in all this? Because I know there was a lot of talk about that during the trial, how they were trying to pin everything back to Gordon.
YORRIE says he did not fire the first shot. The first shot was fired by one of the U.S. Marshals, and it hit him in a pistol that he was carrying on his chest. And it's a 50-50 deal. But he still believes in the tax protest movement, all of this stuff. He bought what is called the red pill completely when he was about 16 years old. He bought the red pill, went down the rabbit hole, and has never come out, and neither has Mr. Fall.
Jim, I know you disagree with.
I do not believe it is a 50-50 deal. The evidence is clear that the first shot was fired by YORRIE Call, and that first shot hit Robert Cheshire. And Bradley Capp will tell you that. He was an officer there. Steve Schnabel, who was hardly an ally of the law enforcement, who was very upset about what happened, he says it was YORRIE Call who fired first. Then Darrell is right in the sense that after Cheshire is hit and he's wounded, then Gordon Call comes along and finishes him off and executes him. But the evidence is overwhelming that YORRIE Call fired first, and he's the one who hit Robert Cheshire first, and that's when all the shooting started from all directions.
Darrell, I want to make sure you get a chance to respond to that.
Well, I'm not going to argue with him because it well could have been. I mean, nobody really knows. I mean, there's an argument about this, and the law enforcement people think that YORRIE Call fired the first shot. I don't necessarily disagree with him. YORRIE Call is a guy that says he didn't. And remember, towards the end of the trial, that pistol was mailed back, and it was subsequently given to the jurors. It was examined in the jury room and had fingerprints all over. We're never going to really know for certain, but I also think it was YORRIE Cole that fired the first shot. He was a young kid. He was behind a pole. He had a pistol. He had a rifle. Things were getting tense, and I suspect he did fire the first shot. Yes, so I'm not going to argue with Jim Shaw.
It almost at this point, given the history and the conflicts that people, depending on their point of view, and also their knowledge of what happened during the time of the shooting and all, that's all going to be debated forever. But it was inevitable. It was inevitable. Some kind of an incident with these folks was inevitable, whether it happened the way it did happen or something later on. And when you read the letter that Gordon Kahl sent from Texas, they believed, when he was still on the run, and what it says, his beliefs, what he had bought into about what he thought was happening to the country was not new. It was part of his life, and it became part of the family's life. It is the way they saw the world, as a battle between good and evil, as a battle between their view of what the Constitution said and what it really says. And so the violence that ensued, while it was shocking and still is shocking when we think about the details, should not be a real surprise in the context of what these people believed and what a lot of people around them believed and what a lot of people today still believe.
But Jack, you're working out of Devil's Lake and you're covering the story.
Yes.
And Darrell, you're working out of Bismarck and you guys are working out of Fargo. Did you ever at night, going back and forth, ever just get that eerie feeling like I really shouldn't be here? I'm curious, Jack.
Well, before, we were in the midst of, remember, the farm crisis of that time. And it was a real thing. I mean, people were losing an average of 3 farms a day, I think, in North Dakota at that time. And so there was real hurt, economic hurt and social, cultural hurt in the rural community in North Dakota. Before this happened, I remember going to meetings in places like Edmore and Church's Ferry up in the Devil's Lake area with farmers, tax protesters is what they were, and protesting the way the federal government was not doing anything to help them, and they were losing their farms. And these were people I knew. I'd see them in town, I'd see them at church and whatnot. And here they were coming into, I think it was the curling club at Edmore at the time, and they were armed to the teeth. And they were debating whether or not I could stay there. They didn't want me there. And this happened in several small towns around that area. So you had this atmosphere that was seething and seething and seething and getting worse and worse. And Gordon Kahl and his family, the people around him, became almost the symbol and heroes to an awful lot of these people who were really feeling the pain from the farm crisis.
Go ahead, Darrell.
Okay, look, a lot of these people who were feeling the pain were good, straight people who had taken the advice of Earl Butts and planted her fence row to fence row.
That's
Remember
right.
that one?
That's right.
Okay. So they had critical financial problems because of what they'd been led into by the U.S. government. But at the same time, then ultra right-wing groups that today you can call the Order, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, QAnon, picked up on this and started going around and talking about the illegality of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which allows the income tax, the fact that you, quote, have sovereignty, the government can't do a thing to you. What you had was a group, and Gordon Kahl was one of them, who were schizophrenic. They were simply schizophrenic individuals, and a lot of them are still out there. And this was a psychotic break. Once they got cornered and they were going to pick up Gordon Kahl, he was convinced, and YORRIE will tell you this, that they were going to kill him, and so he wasn't going in peacefully. But there were a lot of these people, and still are, who have mental problems. And who are they? They're the same people who broke into the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
Jim, I want to raise the same question to you. You're out there. You're traveling the back roads. You're covering this story. Your thoughts at that time?
It was scary. We went into Medina shortly after the shootout. It was clear we were not wanted. People were not friendly to us. They didn't want to talk about anything. Meanwhile, I am dealing and talking to relatives of Gordon Kahl, as I mentioned, Janice Kahl and the daughter, and friends of and relatives of David Brewer, who was one of those convicted in this case. And it was just frightening and alarming. I had never heard this mindset before, that it was okay not to pay taxes, that it was okay to kill federal officers, and they considered themselves real patriots. And it was a real eye-opener. And I just remember being alarmed and being a little afraid and having to watch what I say so as not to upset them. Because up until this shootout, I had no idea this mindset existed in the United States, let alone in our backyard. And then I saw how prevalent it was. You could see it at the trial when they had all these supporters. It's out there, and it's still out there. And it can be very frightening to those who have a different point of view.
Paul, I know you have some more sound too.
Yes, and I will, just to dovetail on what Jim said, some of the people that were associated with the case, you were successful in talking to some, but I was unsuccessful in talking to others who even though they're still around, they're fearful of, if they talk about this case, that they may be a target in the future, and that I encountered that more than once.
Well, I have some fears after what I just did with the forum, that it could be a target on me. I'm hoping my fears are unjustified, but I felt the story needed to be told.
The search for Gordon Kahl led investigators to his home near Heaton, North Dakota, near Minot. And prior to that, or about that time, his wife, Joan Kahl, made a tearful plea for him to turn himself in.
I'm here to do just one thing, and that is to appeal to my husband to give himself up and surrender before anybody else gets hurt. Please, Gordon, please. They won't hurt you. I've been treated real well here. Our son is in critical condition. 2 men are dead. Others are going to be hurt. I don't want you dead, too. Please. I can't take any more.
That was at the federal courthouse, as I recall, Jim.
Yes.
It was
They paraded her out.
right. The U.S.
And of
Attorney's
course,
Office.
they had leverage
Yes.
because Joan Kahl was also being prosecuted. So this would work, just help her if she cooperated with the government this way.
And it did with the jury.
Yes.
Welcome back to News and Views. Joel Heitkamp here, your host, Abby Miller, your producer, Jim Shaw with us, Darrell Dorgan with us, Jack Zaleski with us, and Paul Jurgens. Those are names you know. If you live here in the upper Midwest, you know them quite well. We're talking about the 40th anniversary of the shootout in Medina, and we just played some sound from Joan Kahl pleading with her husband to give himself up. Paul?
Yes, and obviously it didn't. He didn't hear that or didn't
Care.
listen to his wife. And, of course, later he was captured in Arkansas.
Everybody was looking at where there was a posse presence and certain people in your communities.
Where there'd be support for him.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep. And the kind of this underground railroad of posse comitatus type atmosphere, you know.
Now, Jim, covering the trial, Joan Kahl was on trial, but was later acquitted, and we talked before the break about how this tearful plea did help her with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the prosecution.
Well, to be honest with you, I thought it was a farce that they put Joan Kahl on trial. I thought they were piling on. And the reason I say that is because I was at the trial every day. There was not one bit of evidence introduced against her. There was not one witness who testified against her. I'm sitting there the whole trial thinking, why is this person on trial being prosecuted when they are not at all attempting to prove a case against her? The other three, sure, but Joan Kahl made no sense. I think it was just, like we talked about, for leverage, maybe to try to get Gordon Kahl to give himself up or try to make it easier with others, but there was no logical reason. There was no legal reason to prosecute Joan Kahl.
She was just there.
I want to get to Darrell Dorgan. Darrell, your thoughts on that?
Well, listen, I think she was sincere. The statement that she made, no question about it. I have always wondered, too, why they put her on trial. And but do keep in mind that she had, thoughts, and there's nothing wrong with having thoughts, but she bought the red pill a long time ago, too. Later on, after Gordon Call died, she did marry another anti-Semitic and racist guy in California, and that marriage lasted for a number of years. And he's a guy who led a national organization that, with members that are running from reality, seeking cultural degeneracy, and walking around wearing caps and jackets rather than white sheets. She married him next.
And she went on, and later,
having ideas.
Well, later in life, she went on the crazy circuit and spoke, to these right-wing groups about her husband and how he was right and how she was right. So she had to, drink the Kool-Aid, as they say.
I remember a night here at the Fargo Holiday Inn, the room was packed.
Yes.
She came and spoke to that room, and she was one of the heroes of the evening with that whole posse movement. And as you guys pointed out, it's still there. Yeah. It's still there, and as Darrell pointed out quite well, you saw the face of it in many cases on January 6th. Paul, you have some more?
Well, just back to the trial. I talked earlier about some of the exhibits that were left in the courtroom during the trial, in which, they could come and go. But that the door of the ram charger, it was there most of the trial, and I think the excuse was well, it's heavy, and we're going to talk about it, but they left it there. Security at the courthouse was, for our standards, was very tight. And one thing that, in an attempt for a mistrial, someone planted a gun. Do you recall that, Jim? In a dumpster.
Well, it was near West Acres, wasn't it?
Well, yes, in a dumpster, I believe.
It came up during the trial.
They found
a gun.
Right.
And that became a big deal.
Yes. And they found a gun, and they
YORRIE Call's gun.
It was YORRIE Call's gun?
And it was it was YORRIE's pistol, and it was sent back to North Dakota by Gordon Call. Incidentally, he was in Ashley following the shooting. A day later, he went to Ashley and Scott Paul, and he had been hiding in a barn. And then Paul gave himself up. Gordon Call went to Ashley, and then he went to Timberlake, South Dakota, and spent time with a guy whose name, I don't know if he's still alive or not. His name, but I think he spent time with a guy.
Byron Dale.
Byron Dale.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I called down there and talked to him because I had interviewed him a couple of times, and I found out later, or was told later, that Call was in the house when I called down there. So that's where it went. And then he just simply drove south.
I want to go to individuals like Jim. You were in the room. Paul mentioned time and time again, having been in that room, that you've got a door from the ram that's sitting there, and they get to look at each and every day. But you mentioned the fact that in today's world, that trial never would have been allowed to take place here. It never would have had all the personal connections that you had with the judge and with the prosecutor. And
absolutely not. It's stunning that they allowed it to be in Fargo, that Paul Benson was the judge, that Lynn Crooks, good friends with the victims, was the prosecutor. But this all worked to the advantage of the prosecution.
Well, the reason I bring this up, though, is because, Darrell, I know that you speak to YORRIE every now and then. And, to me, his appeals keep getting over, no, you're not going to be able to appeal. I'm not saying he shouldn't be sitting in federal prison. In fact, he wouldn't have wanted me on that jury, okay? That being said, hasn't those cases that these gentlemen just made been put into the appeal process? I mean, why wasn't any of those under consideration, Darrell?
They've been considered, but the classic one is the judge himself was the godfather to one of the U.S. Marshals that was killed. But you would never allow a judge who'd been godfather to a person whose son had been killed to be in charge of the jury. Or in charge of the case. And there were other things like that too that didn't really add up. But they keep appealing. Frankly, I have told him that maybe he should change his appeal process and start saying, look, I'm sorry what I did. I don't believe in this kind of thing anymore, this kind of tripe. And he doesn't buy it. He's still down the rabbit hole, and so is Scott Paul. In their defense, they are very bright, but they are also very guilty.
Jack, a text message comes in, and it says these guys are thought of as heroes still out there to this day for many folks.
Well, yeah, I think they are. And, they don't go under different names and different organizations, and they get elected to office, as we've seen. And so, yeah, it's still out there. And the organization is maybe not as, what's the word I'm looking for, in your face as it was during the farm crisis and during the run up to the shooting. But there is a network, and we've seen it maybe not shooting people, but certainly exercising political power.
So,
I mean, it's there.
Who was bringing up Rudy Giuliani? Was it you, Jack?
Well, this comes out of Jim Corcoran's book, and I didn't realize this had happened, but it came very close. The Justice Department was really, the U.S. Justice Department was really on this one because you had two people killed, and so they wanted to make sure there was an ironclad case and that the prosecution team was the best it could possibly be. And so Giuliani, who was second in command or second ranking person in the Justice Department at that time, the Rudy Giuliani we see now, who's turned into something less than an honorable fellow, but he came to Fargo for a briefing on this thing, got a briefing, went back to Washington. Let me just read this as it's written in Jim Corcoran's book. Several days later, Giuliani further emphasized the point of the Justice Department's interest by sending one of his senior trial lawyers to again assess the situation with the idea of taking on the responsibility of trying the case. In other words, taking it away from Webb and Crooks. Giuliani's envoy, a fellow named Lawrence Lippy, was a man short on pleasantries. He had been one of these guys who'd fired prosecution teams in other parts of the country if he didn't think they measured up. If he felt Lippy, could best handle the case, he wouldn't hesitate to take over in Fargo, he said to Rodney Webb. But following Crook's presentation that day, Lippy leaned back in his chair, looked at the attorneys gathered around the table and told them, "You people have your act together. You will lead the prosecution." Webb was relieved, and it went on from there. So it came close to someone from to take over, and it might have been a different kind of trial. I doubt it. I think the outcome would have been the same. But Webb and Crooks would not have been the lead.
Go ahead, Darrell.
And Jim and Jack are two of my favorite columnists, incidentally, and they're both personal friends. But for instance, the attorneys representing the people who were charged had U.S. Marshals that were sitting behind them, big U.S. Marshals for most of that trial, which also had an emphasis on the jury. I mean, there were just a lot of things that weren't quite right, but no question in my mind that the people who were convicted were guilty.
I vividly remember the trial. What I thought was the most brilliant thing was Prosecutor Lynn Crooks saying right off the bat, we're not here to say who shot whom, because they really didn't know. They know who killed Bob Cheshire, which was first YORRIE Call and then Gordon Call, but they didn't know who fired the shots that killed Ken Muir, that hit Deputy Marshal James Hobson, that hit Deputy Sheriff Brad Kapp, and hit Medina Police Officer Steve Schnabel. So all he was saying was, we know they fired shots, and we know these guys were hit, and it doesn't matter who fired the shots to hit a given individual. And that worked wonders with connecting to the jury, so that took that issue off the plate, and I think that went a strong way towards getting the convictions.
Who did the defense put up on the stand?
They put up Bud Warren.
Yes, a deputy marshal at the time.
Because he went up and said he refused to arrest Gordon Call because he knew how dangerous it was.
Under this type of circumstance.
Under the circumstance, basically sending the message out that these marshals should have known better. Mind you, Call was wanted, but they should have known better to leave him alone because they should have known that there might have been a shootout.
Well, they were coming out of an amped-up meeting about protests and the tax movement, and I think that Marshal Warren at the time had some sort of a relationship. He knew of Gordon Call, and I don't know whether he knew him, closely, but he knew that there was a better way to take him, perhaps at the cafe in Carrington or at the grocery store when he was shopping with Joan, which was weekly, and they could have probably gotten him that way. Without the other people there, it was just those two.
Well, you talk about how it was a Stutzman County deputy that said Gordon Call is in Medina tonight.
Right.
And then the marshals got word, and the marshals came and exercised the warrant, or attempted to, right? How much recon had been done on this man? Because here's my question. How, in North Dakota, everybody knows where you're at and who you are. I mean, he was living here. I mean, were they shocked that he was in Medina? Had they been searching for him before that, or they just chose not to arrest him before that?
I don't think it had been a real top priority. But when they found out, here's our guy at a given place at a given time, that moved it up as, all right, let's go get him. Okay. But I don't think they had actively been going after him. He had not been fugitive number one.
So who else other than Warren did they put on trial? Did Joan speak on the trial, at the trial?
I don't remember that she did.
I don't think so. I don't believe so.
YORRIE spoke. YORRIE
what did he say on stand?
He denied starting the shooting, and he criticized the system and criticized the federal government. I don't think he really did himself any favors.
So in other words, Darrell, nothing's changed from YORRIE. What he was saying then, he's still saying to this day.
No. Yeah, no, he bought into it entirely, and so did Fall, and they're still living that life today, and no question about it. Interestingly enough, I know you're talking about the trial, but there was more than just taxes that were talked about at the meeting in Medina. And one of the things, and this shows you what kind of people, a lot of them you're dealing with here, one of the discussions was whether or not they could form their own township and declared a white-only enclave. In other words, if you were of a different race or a suspect religion, you could not live there. So you're not dealing with,
That's true.
So the point being, this wasn't just, Jack, about taxes. This was about ideology.
No, this was as I said earlier, this was a rather broad-based social and cultural movement that saw the world in black and white, and the black were the bad guys, and they were bankers, and the Jewish conspiracy and the federal government, and the good guys were the people who read the Constitution in their own very, narrow and wrong way, but they bought into it, and there was the racial component, there was the religious component, huge religious component when you read what Gordon Kahl wrote in that letter from Texas, and that translated into justification for violence.
The trial began just weeks, really. I mean, a couple of months after.
3 months.
3 months after the shoot.
3 months, you guys.
That's ridiculous.
That's just
that
amazing.
would never happen today.
No. And it was 3 weeks, roughly.
The Constitution.
And it was a 3-week trial.
Does call for quick justice.
This was quick.
Speedy trial.
Yes. Speedy trial.
So it was May.
May of '83.
The exact date, but YORRIE, Kahl, and Fall were convicted in the deaths of Muir and Deputy Marshal Cheshire, Lynn Crooks, Assistant U.S. Attorney.
Obviously, the jury concluded that there wasn't adequate time to think prior to shooting, I guess. That would be my evaluation of it. But very clearly, they had no trouble at all with the concept of malice aforethought and the other elements of murder. And that, I think, we proved very conclusive.
Jack, I know there's a number of comments by Lynn later on.
Well, later on, Lynn Crooks was interviewed for Jim Corcoran's book, and one of the questions was, did he understand the context of this awful thing, this awful incident with the farm crisis and the farm foreclosures that were going on and all this, and said, and Crooks said this, he says, although he strongly disagreed with the message the extremists, Gordon Kahl and company, offered to farmers, Crooks understood its appeal. He had grown up in the belief that the American farmer was the last of the rugged, free-spirited individualists, and that as long as he didn't bother anybody, he shouldn't be bothered, especially by the government. And Crooks is quoted here. He says, all of a sudden, in a certain sense, we all are, in a certain sense, tax protesters at heart. We don't like taxes. We don't enjoy paying taxes, he said. But as much as we spit, sputter, mutter, complain, and write to our local congressmen, we pay them rather than die on the cross. We see a need for them. But Gordon Kahl, at some point, separated himself from that logic. He went on strike, so to speak, and zeroed in on an antisocial and violent philosophy, and that can't be allowed by society, said Lynn Crooks.
We talk. Go ahead.
I interviewed Lynn Crooks for my series just a few months ago, and Lynn was still very strong with his convictions when he said to me, quote, "Justice was done. The message was, you have to pay your taxes. You cannot murder U.S. Marshals because you don't want to pay your taxes." End of quote.
Darrell, your thoughts on that?
Well, Jim is right, and that's the only thought I would have. I mean, there's still people walking around this country saying the 16th Amendment is not legal. Come on, give me a break. Some of the stuff. And keep in mind also that there were people involved in this movement that were out there selling packets to farmers who were in economic distress for another $500, saying, hey, you file this and claim sovereignty and the government can't touch you. There were people that were in that venue that were making money off of these people too. So not always innocence.
I'll add this about Lynn Crooks. You talk about, people that for many people, Gordon Call ended up being a hero. For some people, Butch Cassidy kind of a thing. Lynn Crooks was from Hankinson. He came to Hankinson a lot. His brothers, one of them I got to know really well, actually two of them. And when you mention Lynn Crooks in Hankinson, there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of pride. Very intelligent, hardworking, what he did in this trial. Just the opposite of this whole Gordon Call could be a hero to some. Lynn Crooks put these guys away. And in Hankinson, I don't think he would have been able to buy a beer. He was pretty popular back in our country. So, Jurgie, you got a little more sound for folks?
June of 1993, Gordon Call finally caught up with him near Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. A hail of gunfire. He exchanged shots with the sheriff there. Gene Matthews, both men died.
Dan Coker, a police spokesman at Walnut Ridge near the shootout scene, says it appears the blaze was started intentionally, apparently to flush out the fugitive.
The house was set fire, and the house was surrounded by law enforcement people, and no one was observed leaving the house. After it burned, they brought equipment in to put the blaze out so they could go into rubble and see what they could find, and a body was found.
But it hasn't been confirmed whether it is Gordon Call?
No, positive identification will be made by probably the FBI.
Coker says the house Call apparently died in was located about 75 miles northeast of Little Rock. It was described as a fortress. Police arrested two people who owned the home. Leonard and Norma Ginter will apparently be charged with harboring a fugitive.
Now, as I recall...
That sounds like a young Paul Jurgen voice.
I guess so. That was, 40 years ago. It kind of surprised me, but authorities, they admitted that they set the house on fire. I mean...
Oh, yeah, to flush him out.
But, the story that's being told now differs from the story then. The story that's being told now...
Well, right there... That our officer said, they set the house on fire.
Right. Yet Sheriff Matthews goes into the house along with two other law enforcement people. He sees Gordon Call hiding behind a refrigerator.
Yes.
The two fired at each other almost simultaneously. They hit each other. Matthews hits Call in the head. He dies instantly. Matthews is hit in the heart. He's still surviving. He's crawling out.
Gets out, yes.
And so as he's crawling out of the house, the SWAT team that's outside the house sees that Matthews is out, so they feel he's safe, and they don't have no clue about Gordon Call, so they assume he's still alive and well in the house, and that's why they just opened fire and set the house on fire, because they thought Gordon Call was still alive in the house at that time.
Now, as I was listening back to some of this archive sound, the house burned for an hour and a half, and there were tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition that went off while the house burned, and there were multiple explosions.
This is about the fifth text message I've gotten on this. So somebody jump in. If somebody says, please ask your panel if they heard that they actually dug Gordon up years later to check his dental records. And I've gotten a number of these. Anybody hear anything like that?
No, well, I heard he was abducted by aliens, and then he was brought back later. Then he died, and then they dug him up.
So you got all those type of rumors.
Come on.
Darrell, Darrell, when you were covering this and you looked at it, was there ever a time that you thought Gordon was just going to get away, that they never were going to catch him?
No. He was going to be caught, and he was either going to prison for the rest of his life or he was going to die in a shootout. And I always thought that he would die in a shootout because he had always warned people. And again, I think he had critical mental problems. And, so that's what it was. I just didn't think that he would ever survive this after what he had done. And, he'd been on television in Texas. I actually think he'd been on television in North Dakota on the KX network at one point talking about don't pay your taxes. That's why the federal government went after him. After his conviction, he goes on television and radio and talks about don't pay your income taxes, don't pay your... They're not going to let that stand.
Jack, did you ever think he was going to get away?
No, I thought that the federal government was so focused, so laser focused on getting this guy. They'd get him one way or another, as Darrell just described. But I don't agree with Darrell that he was mentally, and I don't know, he's never was examined, I imagine, but that he was, had some sort of mental problem. That sort of gives him an excuse. I think he was just a bad guy who made bad decisions. And, you throw in the mental factor, you sort of give him a break, and I won't do that.
Jim, did you ever think...
He was examined mentally down in Texas when he was in the penitentiary. And, they said that he had real psychotic tendencies and there were other issues too, but they said there were some mental problems.
Jim, did you ever think he was going to get away?
I did. Unlike the others, I was quite surprised that they found him because it was clear that he had a huge network across this country of people who support him and would hide him. And I'm still curious. I don't know if it's ever come out how they found him, but I thought he was well protected, and I thought he would be hidden for the rest of his life.
Well, he made it a long way, all the way to Arkansas.
Made it all the way.
He certainly had a network.
But I thought, weren't the Ginters on the Fed's radar?
Yes, they were.
Right.
Yes, they were.
So
how long was it from the shootout to when they got him?
Oh,
4 months.
4 months.
Yeah, 4 months.
Okay, so he was gone for a while.
February to June.
In terms of journalism, they got about a minute each. But I know, Jim, you wanted to. I know there's a question of whether or not you're supposed to apologize to Scott Fall.
Well, yeah, this was a stunner. I just, as a lark, I sent letters to YORRIE Call and Scott Fall and tried to get an interview, and Scott Fall wrote back, and it just shows he hasn't changed a bit. He is still angry at the government, calls them names you can't say on the airwaves here, said he did not get a fair trial, said that people in the media like me were responsible for his conviction, and therefore he demanded an apology from me in order for him to give me an interview. Well, obviously I'm not going to do that, but but the crazy thing is the more that Scott Fall says that, and the more that YORRIE Call sticks to that mindset, they're never going to get released. If this trial happened today, they would not be eligible for parole, but now they are because of the system 40 years ago. And so if they ever said that they have remorse and are sorry for what they did and admitted what they did, they could probably get out. Yeah. But they refuse to play that game.
Darrell, how did this affect you as a journalist?
Well, really strange. I watched, and until this happened, I didn't know that, I knew this was going on because I'd attended some meetings and we'd interviewed some of these people. But, he believed the government is nothing but an expansion of the Christian church. And there are a lot of people out there today that believe that kind of thing. And they want the they think the U.S. Constitution was derived from the Bible. He and the posse believed they were sovereign and didn't have an obligation to have a driver's license, pay income taxes, birth certificates, Social Security cards. And basically what it really did is this was the beginning of Oklahoma City, Ruby Ridge. This was the first shot, okay? And how did it change my world and your world? Well, it changed the news media entirely until this, shortly thereafter, we had a deregulation of broadcasting. Okay, that's how you ended up with the crazies like Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones, and They go out there and they talk, and they are the people that keep this kind of thing going. I mean, we have a guy in Bismarck that's on the air at night called Stu Peters, who every night talks about, you get a shot, you're going to die. You get a shot, you're going to die. I mean, it's totally crazy. And he is sponsored by Beck Electric Cooperative out of Steele, North Dakota. They put that station together, okay? Cooperatives used to be informational gathering places where the truth was told and that kind of thing. And they let this happen. And not only that, there are several board members who get a lot of federal money every year, and still they let this kind of thing go on.
Jack,
how bad they
I want to make sure everybody gets in, though. Jack?
Well, I'll tell you, what it did for me as a relatively young journalist up at Devil's Lake is it showed me, I had this idyllic vision of agriculture, of American agriculture, the American farmer. But this farm crisis was deepening, and I didn't realize how deep it was and how serious it was and how many people were being hurt until this incident and the incidents surrounding it covered some of those meetings, as I told you before the shooting. And so I think in some ways it made me a better journalist because it helped me to understand what was going on in a part of the country that I was covering as a journalist, a small part of the country. And it was deep and it was serious and it's still there. And just as an aside, for people who are not as old and wise as we all think we are, I would recommend that you find the archive, the Forum archive, Inform archive, and read Jim's Shaw's stories. That's January 14th, January 21st, January 28th. It's a wonderful historical retrospective, and bringing this thing up to date that would really give you a good picture of it. And the other recommendation, Jim Corcoran's book, Bitter Harvest, which I just learned is still available online for what, $9? Yep. $9. And so I would recommend those two resources for those who didn't live it and would like to know more about it.
Okay. Paul, you did a lot of homework on this. You're 21. How did it affect you?
I'd never covered anything like this. This was my first trial, and I was scared to death. I had to learn a lot from other reporters who had covered federal courts in general, and I really didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I worked for KFGO, and I had to do the best I could, and I did. I think I did a fair job. I had a lot of support here with people back at the station, but it was my trial to cover, and I learned something about courtroom decorum during the course of the case. One of the deputy marshals, courtroom security, pulled me out of the courtroom, and I thought, "Oh, what's happened here? What's going on?" And he said, "Mr. Jurgens, yes, Judge Benson wanted you to know that your shirt tail is hanging out. Could you tuck in your shirt tail?" Yes, sir.
A text message comes in and says, I talked to Scott Fall's daughter, and I'm very good friends. She's married to a good friend of mine. She told me her dad will never get out. They'll plant something in his cell. Thanks, guys. Good riding with you.